can't remember the last time Andrew bowed his head before his father's photo. Maybe it was the first year after the funeral. Maybe never. But that morning, when Rachel called through choked sobs and said, "Mom, you need to come home right now. He burned Dad's altar," I knew. Every final thread of hope inside me had snapped. I drove my Maybach straight to the old house in Brookline, the home I had gifted to Andrew and Melissa as a wedding present. The mahogany door still bore streaks of soot. In the living room, where George's altar once stood, there was only a scorched patch of wall. The silver picture frame lay cracked in two. The portrait of George in his tailored suit, holding a glass of red wine, now reduced to ash. Only his eyes remained, staring from the cinders. Andrew stood there. No remorse. No explanation. Just a file folder in hand. "I can't take it anymore, Mom. Dad's gone. This house is mine, and so is the rest of the estate. He promised me. Said I was the heir. You can't keep everything like this." I used to think I understood the limits of what a mother could endure, but that morning, seeing George's portrait turned to ashes, and Andrew standing in its place with a folder of demands, I realized the worst hadn't even begun. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I didn't lash out, not the way you might expect. If you want to know what I did next, then don't take your eyes off this story, and don't forget to hit subscribe. I didn't scream. I didn't tremble. I simply looked him in the eye, and in that stare, I saw the little boy who once feared thunderstorms, who used to crawl into my bed when the power went out. Now, that same boy, the one I bore and raised, was lighting a match to his father's memory for the illusion of claiming $1 billion I still controlled. He didn't know things had changed 20 years ago. Back in 2005, George and I rewrote the will. After Andrew repeatedly drained family funds under the guise of investment, we decided to transfer all assets, our investment portfolio, company shares, even the penthouse in downtown Boston, into my name. George recorded a video explaining the decision. "Margaret," he said, "is the only one clear-headed enough to preserve this family's legacy." I kept that video in a safe, along with the original will notarized 3 times, backed by a psychiatric wellness certificate and statements from Rachel and attorney Braxton. Andrew had no idea. He still believed the old 2002 will was in effect. He thought all he had to do was convince a court that I was mentally unfit after George's death, and everything would revert to him. He was wrong, and that mistake began with the fire he set to his father's altar. That afternoon, I returned to my penthouse. The chill in the air clung to the windows. I sat down in silence and poured myself a cup of Earl Grey. The room was quiet, like my grief. I looked at George's photo on the table, a reprint, since the original had turned to ash, and whispered, "I won't let you be ashamed of me." My hands didn't shake, but my heart broke into pieces, not for what was lost, but because for the first time in my life, I had to rise against my own son. I remembered the last time George placed his hand on my shoulder at attorney Braxton's office. "Don't hesitate, Margaret. He's not that little boy anymore. We have to protect what's left." I had hesitated then. I still believed Andrew might change, but the day he used our company name to borrow $200,000 in high-interest loans and put our family shares up as collateral, I knew if I didn't act, I'd be the next casualty. We never told Andrew about the new will. George passed 8 months later from a stroke. I wanted to preserve peace for the children. But what peace remains when your own son sees you as an obstacle? Rachel called again that night. "Do you want me to file a report for property destruction?" I said no, not because I feared Andrew, but because I didn't want Rachel dragged into the black hole of this bitterness. But I was done avoiding. I opened the safe, pulled out the will, asset files, the appraisal for the $10 million penthouse, banking paperwork, and multi-factor investment credentials. I photographed every page and sent them to attorney Braxton, along with a message. "If he takes this to court, I'll be there, but this time, I'm not coming to negotiate." Boston nights are colder than I remember, but somehow I felt warm, because beneath the pain, I could feel it. I wasn't weak anymore, and if my son chose to burn the past for $1 billion fantasy, then I would rise from those ashes, to protect what George once called a mother's final dignity. I didn't realize Andrew had forged my signature right away, not because I was careless, but because I was still his mother. After the altar incident, I thought that had to be the final line. I sent all the evidence to my attorney. I didn't file criminal charges, but I made one thing clear to Andrew. From now on, everything will be handled legally. I thought that would be enough. I was wrong. A week later, I received a notice from the bank. One of the secondary accounts under my investment portfolio, opened 4 years ago, had been almost entirely emptied. Over $120,000. All transactions bore a digital signature, mine. I called Kevin, George's former financial advisor. He reviewed the system history and said, "Mrs. Margaret, the signature doesn't match your last verified one, but it was authorized through a secondary API. It only required mobile ID verification. It looks like someone used the old number you had back in 2021. My heart dropped. That phone, I had given it to Andrew on his 38th birthday, a modest gift compared to everything I'd done for him. But now it had become a tool he used to legally steal from me. I instructed the bank to freeze all secondary accounts and switch all access to biometric verification, but the $120,000 was gone. I sat in Attorney Braxton's office, staring at the bank statement as it emerged from the fax machine. The ink had smudged slightly in one corner, right where it listed the time of withdrawal, 3:14 p.m. last Wednesday. At that exact moment, I had been sitting in a group therapy session for mothers whose adult children had cut off contact. That day, the facilitator, Marcia, had said, "Sometimes our children don't leave us because we were wrong. They leave because we were right, and they couldn't handle that truth." I carried that sentence with me into the night. I had forgiven Andrew. Not once. Many times. The time he used my credit card to book first-class tickets for his honeymoon with Melissa, without asking. The time he pawned George's vintage Rolex and pretended it was stolen. The time he claimed he was fundraising for charity, only for me to find out he used $50,000 I wired him to buy a used Lamborghini at an auction. Each time, I stayed quiet. I told myself, he's my son. He's struggling. If I can help, I should. But repeated help is not compassion. It's a velvet noose, and I was the one tightening it around my own neck. This time, I couldn't ignore it, not just because of the money, but because he had destroyed the one thing that still kept me tethered to the identity of a forgiving mother. Trust. 3 days later, Attorney Braxton called. Andrew's side had sent a request for out-of-court negotiation. I declined. I didn't want to see him again. But then Rachel called. She was crying. "Mom, I don't know what to do. He came to me. He cried, 'Mom,' he said you cut him out completely, that you don't trust him anymore, that you're treating him like a stranger. Mom, I know he's done awful things, but he's still my brother. Can't you just talk to him once?" I bit my lip. Rachel was the one child who had never let me down, but this time I felt a shadow of fear creep in. What if Andrew was trying to use her to soften me again? I nodded. "Fine, but I'm bringing my attorney, and you stay outside." The meeting took place at a neutral office. Andrew sat across from me, white shirt, crooked tie, dark circles under his eyes, but still with that arrogant posture, the same as always, the posture of someone who still believed he couldn't lose. I looked at him, and I didn't see the boy I used to rock to sleep. I saw a stranger, ambitious, exhausted, and desperate. He began with a tone halfway between guilt and manipulation. "Mom, I know I messed up, but you can't keep doing this. I'm your son. Are you really giving everything to Rachel, or putting it all into Dad's charity fund?" I didn't respond. I simply slid a folder across the table, containing everything he'd done, from forged transactions to altered bank logs, and I said one thing. "You said you loved your father, then burned his memorial photo. You called me the only one who ever stood by you, then used my own signature to steal from me. So tell me, Andrew, what part of this is still family?" He stared at me. His eyelid twitched, his lips pressed together. I thought he might shout, but he didn't. He stood, shook his head, and said, "I just want what I deserve." I watched him walk out, then turned to Braxton. "We don't settle. We move forward." That night, I didn't sleep. I stood on the penthouse balcony overlooking the glowing city of Boston. Each light below could be a family, a mother, a son. I thought of George. If he were still here, what would he say? Sometimes, kindness doesn't save anyone. It just prolongs the tragedy. I placed my hand over my heart, quietly. No tears. But for the first time, deep in my soul, I no longer felt like a victim. I was a survivor. And the next chapter? I would write it with strength, not fear. I started by changing the locks on the penthouse, not because I thought Andrew might break in, but because I needed one tangible, concrete act to say to myself, from this moment on, I am the rightful owner, not just of this home, but of my life. I picked up the phone and called Eleanor, George's old friend, a former Massachusetts state prosecutor. We hadn't spoken since George passed, but her voice was still firm, steady as ever. "Margaret, you want to strike back? Fine, but we're not going to play with feelings. We're going to fight with paperwork." And just like that, the quiet resistance began. I sat in the private library, the attic room George once used for reading and chess, to reconstruct the full financial timeline from 2010 to now. Every dollar I had transferred to Andrew, every asset sold, mortgaged, or renamed. I flipped through every bank statement, every sales contract, even old text messages I had once ignored, because I loved my son too much. And then it hit me. In the past 7 years, I had given Andrew over $2.2 million, not a cent repaid. And that was just the visible part. When I compiled the full asset record, the numbers were sobering. Long-term investment funds, over $600 million equity in George's energy company, nearly $280 million. Domestic and international real estate, around $90 million. Liquid assets, art, cars, savings, approximately $30 million. All of it currently under my name, per the 2005 will. I sent everything to Eleanor. 2 days later, she called back. Margaret, I don't want to scare you, but if Andrew's legal team manages to cast doubt on your mental capacity when the will was signed, he could reverse everything. I replied calmly, I'm prepared. She hesitated. Are you truly ready to take your son to court? I paused, then answered softly, I'm not taking my son to court. I'm taking a man who's exploiting family ties to demand $1 billion into the light. Rachel visited on a rainy afternoon. She brought blueberry muffins and a small bag, holding the scarf I had knitted for her last year. Are you doing okay, Mom? I nodded, but Rachel's eyes told me she already knew the answer. Mom, I'm sorry for asking you to talk to Andrew. I get it now. Some people, the more chances you give them, the more they use those chances to hurt you. I smiled and gently brushed her hair back, like I used to when she was little. It's all right, sweetheart. I once believed my son was the brightest light in my life, but now I see. I was looking in the wrong direction. The real light is you. That same evening, I signed a legal power of attorney, granting Eleanor full authority to represent me in all disputes, asset protection included. I knew Eleanor wasn't like Braxton. She wasn't soft. She didn't compromise. She was the woman who once put 3 corporate CEOs behind bars for embezzlement. And I needed someone like that, not to destroy Andrew, but to protect what George and I had spent a lifetime building. I began reappearing at community events, gatherings I had declined since George's death. I relaunched the George Whitmore Scholarship Fund, awarding grants to 15 students studying clean energy. A local newspaper ran the headline, A Mother Rises After the Storm, Margaret Whitmore's Mission to Preserve a Family's Legacy. Andrew must have read it, because 2 days later, I received an email, not from him, but from his new attorney at a small firm in Newton, subject line, Settlement Proposal, Condition, Revocation of Margaret Whitmore's Asset Authority. I laughed, not in relief, but in bitterness. He still didn't get it. I wasn't fighting for the money anymore. I was fighting to reclaim the right to be a mother, one not bound by financial obligation. 4 days later, I flew to Geneva to meet with the Board of Trustees managing a financial trust George had established in 2010 worth over $4.7 million. I requested a formal beneficiary change from Andrew to Rachel and the nonprofit Clean Future. When I signed the form, my hand didn't tremble, but my heart went still. I was erasing my son from my future, a decision no mother wants to make, unless she's been brought to the edge of heartbreak. Back in Boston, a package arrived, a handwritten letter, no return name. The handwriting was unmistakable, the same script I taught Andrew when he was in first grade. Mom, if you wanted to turn me into the enemy, congratulations. You've also lost your last chance to keep this family whole. I read every word, without blinking. Then I tore the letter into 3 pieces and fed it into the incense burner, not because I hated my son, but because I would no longer let guilt dictate my choices. That night, as rain tapped against the penthouse windows, I poured myself a glass of red wine, the kind George loved, Syrah from the Rhone Valley. I raised my glass and whispered, Rest easy, love. I won't let what you built be crushed by greed. Beneath Boston's overcast sky, for the first time, I felt something I had never felt this clearly. I had chosen right. I wasn't fighting with tears. I was fighting with law, with strategy, with rebirth. I was no longer Margaret, the mother who endured. I was Margaret, the final guardian of a legacy. I always thought that if I ever found myself in court, it would be to defend someone I loved, not to defend myself against the child I gave birth to. But that morning, wearing the gray coat George bought me on our last trip to Florence, I walked into Suffolk County Court like a soldier without armor, yet with a heart hardened like steel. Not because I was unbreakable, but because I no longer had a choice. The courtroom smelled of old wood and dry air conditioning. I sat on the plaintiff's side, next to Eleanor. Andrew sat across from me, 4 meters away beside his lawyer, a young man with slicked back hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. I didn't look at my son during the opening arguments, not because I couldn't, but because I was protecting the last part of myself that hadn't shattered completely. We intend to prove that Margaret Whitmore was not mentally fit to amend her will in 2005, Andrew's lawyer began. The estate was reassigned during a period of grief-induced depression following the death of her husband, directly impairing her judgment. We request the court revoke the legal validity of the 2005 document and reinstate the 2002 will, in which Mr. Andrew Whitmore is the primary heir. I turned to Eleanor. She gave a single nod. Your Honor, she said, we will demonstrate that Mrs. Margaret Whitmore revised her will with full mental clarity and of her own volition to protect an estate worth nearly $1 billion, including corporate shares, investment funds, real estate, and liquid assets, from the very son who has abused her trust. They called me to the stand first. I stood in the center of the courtroom, placing my hand on the Bible, George's Bible, the one he used to keep on the library shelf. My voice didn't shake, but my throat was dry as the desert. I changed my will after discovering that Andrew had used the pretense of investment to divert over $200,000 from our family fund. Before that, I'd overlooked many things, using my credit card to buy a luxury car, posing as a charity fundraiser to purchase a Patek Philippe watch. But at some point, a mother has to stop closing her eyes. I remembered the first time I discovered Andrew had forged my signature on a bank authorization form. The ink was fresh, but the pen stroke was all wrong. I had studied calligraphy for nearly 10 years. I knew my own handwriting. I printed the form and left it on the dining table overnight. No tears, no shouting, just silence. A cold cup of tea in my hand, staring at that forged signature, realizing forgiveness does not mean silence. The court played a video of George reading his will, recorded in Attorney Braxton's office. His voice was calm, slightly weary, but unmistakably firm. I, George Whitmore, of sound mind and judgment, leave all of my estate and company shares within the Whitmore Energy Trust to my wife, Margaret Whitmore. The reason, she is the only person I trust to protect our family's values. In the video, I could be heard whispering, "Are you sure? I don't want the kids to misunderstand." George smiled, placed a hand on my shoulder. "If they misunderstand, that started long ago. You're not responsible for carrying that anymore." Andrew's lawyer brought in a psychologist, someone who had never met me, but presented speculative diagnoses based on the frequency of my Facebook posts mourning George after his death. Eleanor chuckled. For the first time in my life, I saw someone use a smile as a sharper weapon than words. "Your Honor," she said, "if grieving publicly is proof of legal incapacity, then all of America should have to rewrite their wills after Thanksgiving." The courtroom murmured. Rachel was called as a witness. She sat upright, her eyes never leaving mine. My mother is the most clear-minded person I've ever known. Even after my father died, she not only held on to her reason, she held our family together, even when some of us didn't deserve it. Andrew furrowed his brow. Rachel didn't look at him. Finally, I was given the chance to speak one last time. I stepped forward. No notes. Every word I spoke came not from a document, but from my heart. I love my son, but I do not love betrayal. I don't hate him, but I refuse to be used. I never wanted to cut my son out of my will, but if keeping him in it means losing the last piece left in me, then I choose limited solitude over endless suffering. What George and I built was not a reward. It was the fruit of a life lived with decency. And it deserves to be guarded, not gambled away like a billion-dollar poker chip. The court recessed for 45 minutes. I didn't sit. I didn't speak to anyone. I stood alone in the hallway, watching sunlight pierce through stained glass. It was beautiful, like the truth when finally spoken, no matter how painful. When I returned to the courtroom, Judge Hargrove read the verdict. After reviewing all evidence and witness testimony, the court finds the 2005 will legally valid, with no indication of diminished capacity. All motions to void the document are denied. Andrew slumped. His lawyer whispered something to him, but I didn't hear it. All I saw were my son's eyes, red, pained, unsure from anger, shame, or the realization that some battles don't end in victory. They end in loss of someone who will never return. I left the courthouse and climbed into the Maybach. Eleanor said nothing, neither did I. We rode in silence, like two women who had just buried a long, painful chapter of their lives. Back home, I opened the safe and pulled out George's old USB, the original will video. I played it, not to watch, but to hear him again, to hear the voice of the only man who had ever believed in me without conditions. Margaret, if you're watching this, then something hard just happened, but you are stronger than you know, and if you must, remember, we didn't build all this just to let someone sign it away. I cried. Not out of sadness, but because, for the first time in years, I felt George was still here. People often say that peace follows the storm, but I didn't feel peace, only a kind of emptiness, like standing in a house that once was home, now stripped bare. No footsteps, no morning tea aroma, no warmth. After the trial, I returned to the penthouse, shut the door, turned off my phone, and saw no one for 3 days. I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I didn't shed tears over victory. I didn't feel relief. I just felt tired. On the 4th morning, Rachel brought hot soup. She didn't say much, just placed the bowl on the kitchen counter. "Eat something, Mom. It's cold today." I nodded, but the spoon in my hand never touched the food. Rachel sat down, her hands clasped. "I saw Andrew." I looked up. Not surprised, just waiting for the next sentence. "He's not the same. Thinner, talks a lot, nonsense. Then he cries, then he laughs, then he asks me, 'Does Mom hate me?'" I didn't respond. My eyes drifted to the window. Snow had begun to fall, light and thin like ashes from George's old altar. Rachel exhaled, her voice trembling. "Mom, I'm not defending him, but if you have nothing left to lose, maybe you could give him a word, not forgiveness, just closure." That evening, I sat down to write a letter. Not an email, not a message. A handwritten letter, each word carefully penned, as if drawn from my throat. "Dear Andrew, I don't know if you expect this letter. I don't know how you'll read it, with resentment, regret, or indifference, but I know I need to write it, not for you, for myself. There are nights I wake from dreams where you're 5 years old, squatting on the floor playing Lego with your father. Back then, you asked, 'If I do something wrong, will you leave me?' I held you close and said, 'No, I'll never leave you, but I'll teach you to live rightly.' I kept my word, but you forgot that question. Andrew, I no longer harbor resentment, nor blind love. I have only what those who've been hurt retain, boundaries. I didn't retaliate against you. I protected myself. I didn't remove you from the will out of hatred. I did it to discourage a future where betrayal is rewarded. If one day you truly change, you don't need to prove it to me. Just live differently, and if somewhere your father is watching, I believe he'd want that too. This isn't forgiveness, but it is the final word. Live well." Mom, I sealed the letter in an envelope, unaddressed. I didn't send it. I placed it in my desk drawer. Maybe one day I'll give it to Andrew. Maybe never. But I know, writing it allowed me to breathe again. I didn't retaliate against my child. I protected myself. I didn't remove him from the will out of hatred. I did it to discourage a future where $1 billion becomes a reward for betrayal. 2 weeks later, I received an invitation. The inauguration of the George Whitmore Community Library, a project I quietly funded after the trial. Located on the outskirts of Cambridge, the library offers books, reading rooms, and scholarships for children from immigrant families. I wore a beige overcoat, donned the vintage watch George wore when we first met at Harvard. The ceremony was modest, just a few dozen attendees. But one thing choked me up. At the entrance, beneath the bronze plaque, was a small inscription I hadn't requested. For Margaret, who kept her heart, even when she lost her own flesh and blood. I turned to Rachel. "You?" She just smiled. "Not me. Someone whose name starts with A, but no signature." I understood. I said nothing, asked no more. That night, I returned to the penthouse, retrieved the will from the safe. I didn't alter the will. But I added a note. If Andrew Whitmore, in the future, demonstrates through actions, not words, that he can live rightly, the trustee, Rachel Whitmore, has the authority to reinstate a portion of the educational fund for the grandchildren. I don't call it forgiveness. I call it a door, not open, but not locked either. I sat on the moss-green velvet sofa, poured a cup of Earl Grey, added a slice of fresh lemon. I gazed out the window, where Boston's city lights shimmered like glowing veins. Night fell, but within me a faint light rose. not from joy, but because finally I no longer had to strain to forgive or to hate. I didn't return to the old house in Brookline. I didn't destroy Andrew's documents. I just placed everything into the non-urgent file, like a room in my heart once filled with love, now holding a cold file worth $1 billion. But I choose to live, not alongside hatred, but beyond it. I begin each morning by opening the balcony doors, regardless of the weather. Some days, the biting wind cuts to the bone. Others, sunlight drapes the carpet like golden threads. No 2 days are the same, and in that unpredictability, I find proof that I am still alive. Since the trial, I've stopped measuring my life in years. Now, I count it in small acts, things I once believed were reserved for those untouched by hardship. I enrolled in a watercolor class at the MFA. I bought the vintage bicycle George once wanted to gift me, even though I can't ride through the park without getting winded. I've learned to turn off my phone before 10 p.m., no longer staying up waiting for a goodnight message from grown children who've forgotten that mothers, too, need to be remembered. Every Thursday, I buy myself flowers, not for Valentine's, not for birthdays, not waiting for someone else to remember. One early spring afternoon, Rachel stopped by with a thin folder. "Mom, I know you're no longer involved in public philanthropy, but there's a file I'd like you to read." Inside was the story of a young woman orphaned at 9, now studying law. She wrote, "I don't want to be a lawyer to win cases. I want to stand for those who've been silenced." I paused at that line. Within me stirred a sense of continuity, as if the battle I once fought in court now coursed through the veins of someone I've never met. I looked at Rachel. "Send her $5,000. No, $10,000. And make it clear it's a scholarship in the name of George and Margaret." Sometimes I still dream. In my dreams, Andrew sits on the steps of our old Brookline home, wearing a worn shirt, holding a photo of our family from 1998. He asks, "Mom, have you forgiven me yet?" I don't answer. I just sit beside him, both of us watching the setting sun. Upon waking, there's no pain, only lightness, as if I've released a stone I once mistook for my heart. At the end of March, I visit George's grave. Boston remains cold, but the snow has melted. His resting place lies beneath a bare maple tree, yet green buds are emerging from the soil. I sit on the wooden bench beside his grave, holding a book. "You know, George, I've lived through things we never imagined." I don't need to speak loudly. He'll understand. "There were times I thought I'd lost everything, not money, not assets, but the very reason to exist." I pause, gazing at the barren branches. But in the end, I didn't lose. I changed. And perhaps change isn't loss, it's evolution. The George Whitmore Library has just received its largest donation to date, not from a government grant, but from an anonymous benefactor. I don't need to ask who. It could be Rachel. It could be Andrew. Either way, I won't investigate. Some questions, once they cease to matter, render their answers mere exercises in forgiveness. I no longer hope for Andrew to return with an apology. I no longer wait for a midnight birthday call. I simply continue living, without the feeling of absence. One late spring day, I receive a letter from a woman in Florida, around my age. She writes, "I read about you. I too was sued by my daughter over property. You have no idea. Every time I think I'm the worst mother in America, I reread your words in court. Assets are not rewards for betrayal." And I realize I'm not alone. I fold the letter and place it in the wooden keepsake box beside our family photo album. For the first time in years, I allow myself to believe that personal pain can become a beacon for others. Summer arrives early. Each morning, I walk around Silverwood Lake, the place George once took me for our anniversary. I carry a notebook, jotting down small observations. Falling leaves, sunlight dancing on the water, children's laughter. No more heaviness in my heart, no more recurring questions. Why my child? Because sometimes there's no reason, only consequences, and how we rise afterward. I don't return to the old house in Brookline. I haven't discarded Andrew's documents. I've simply placed everything in a non-urgent file. It's like a room in my heart, unlocked, but seldom visited. I no longer hope for Andrew to return with an apology. I no longer wait for a midnight birthday call. I just keep living, alongside the values I salvaged from the brink. Not just the $1 billion, but 72 years of integrity that had never been properly acknowledged. On the last evening of June, Rachel comes over for dinner. She brings an early birthday gift, a watercolor painting of me, sitting by the window, holding a cup of tea, with the sunset in the background. I study the painting for a long time, not for its technique, but because, for the first time, I see myself from the outside, a serene woman who has successfully protected a vast legacy while preserving her humanity. Rachel softly says, "Mom, you don't need to forgive to ease others' minds. You only need to forgive to lighten your own heart." And I realize spring has truly begun. Not because the trees are budding, but because I've learned to step out from the shadow of the enduring mother, to become a woman no longer consumed by distorted familial ties. I share this story not to complain, nor to expose the hidden corners of a seemingly perfect family. I share it because somewhere out there, mothers are silently enduring, afraid of being misunderstood if they speak up, afraid of being labeled cruel for protecting themselves. Sacrifice isn't wrong, but it shouldn't be the default. Sometimes, love means setting boundaries, preserving self-respect, even if it leads to solitude. Assets can be monetary. But some things are more valuable: trust, peace, and the assurance that our lives aren't meaningful. If you stand at the threshold of forgiveness or severance, remember, forgiveness isn't to comfort others, it's to bring peace to yourself. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If you've ever remained silent, thinking you had no right to speak, you are not alone. And if this story made you reflect, shed a tear, or simply breathe a little easier, please leave a comment. Share your feelings. We read every word. And if you wish to hear more stories like this, where mothers no longer endure in silence, where family ties are examined through truth, subscribe to the She Stories Margaret channel, where we share heartfelt stories that deserve to be heard and cherished. Because sometimes, in a story that isn't ours, we find ourselves. This is a fictional story, not intended to offend or target anyone. It was created solely to convey a meaningful lesson to the viewer, and all character names are completely fictional.